All right. So as we talk about utilities, a common conversation we come across a lot is how do we get to net zero? Do we have goals to get to net zero? And what are the ways we're doing that? So before our next panel comes up, really briefly, if you are not familiar with the National Public Utilities Council, our next speaker will be giving a brief description about the NPUC, and its mission and what it's all about. So please help me in welcoming the founder of the NPUC, Angel Lance.
It happening? Oh, hi. Hello, NPUC. I want to talk a little bit about it, but not too much, because I really want to talk about not what we've done, but what we're going to do. Because we're going to talk about accelerating the discussion and the action to get to net zero, because we've already talked a lot about the barriers and about all the problems and how difficult it is and all the different facets and how complex and how far-reaching, how global, how intimate, how everything we have talked and talked and talked. How many people here have been to a conference on this very subject in the last year, besides this one? Almost everyone, right? In every one of those conferences or any one of those discussions that you have with your neighbors or you have with your colleagues or you have with your family, how often does the term ESG come up? Or environment or social justice? Almost every single one, right? Even with your kids. It's constant, it's everywhere. Fantastic. So let's stop talking or continue talking, but now let's start doing. We're gonna bring sexy back. We're bringing sexy back to utilities. Do you guys believe me? Yes. Of course. Look at these pants. Clearly. All right, the NPUC was born because I was on a panel. I'm a management consultant, founder of Motive Power, which is a consulting company based in the Bay Area, nationally servicing utilities, focused on change management and data innovation and all that management consulting stuff, ESG, implementation. Okay, good. However, what it really is about doing, less talking, more do. I was on a panel, we were talking about, man, it'd be so cool if utilities could get together and share their investment practices, share their educational tools, share their community outreach platform across utilities, share them across geographies, share them across states and political divides. I was on the panel with CenterPoint Energy, APS, I think, Southern California Edison, large utilities. And I said, well, why don't we do that? They said, well, Angel, there's no way we're going to do that. We really have to focus on our communities. We have so much on our plates. You know, utilities move slowly. Who here has heard that term? It just won't happen. We're too bureaucratic. There's no way. And I said, okay, well, I'm a doer, so I'll do it. So we started the NPUC 2 years ago. And what we did is we started with roundtables where people, it was during the pandemic, so it was virtual largely. But strangely, that didn't matter because the subject matter is too important. We started coming together, utilities from over more than 30 of our states in the union, and a lot of their C-suite executives and their capital project delivery people came to the table to discuss the things that are hard about ESG, things that are hard about decarbonization, things that are in the way. We categorized all those things. We benchmarked, we discussed, we talked about, in some cases, pro-carbonization. Ever heard that term? Very prevalent in states like Wyoming, which matter a lot. Their entire economy is based on something that is somewhat counter to our point. It's a big deal, right? We talked about political divides. We talked about geographical challenges. We talked about it all. And then what we did is we came up with a report, which all of you have access to. It is the first annual Utilities Decarbonization Report. It ranks the top 30 IOUs in their efforts to decarbonize. And it very scientifically and clearly, I think, lays out how it is that folks are stacking themselves up and really where they're headed. So that's really good. We've done our homework, essentially, and we've disseminated that to, or we've sent it out to everybody. Yeah, yes, NPUC, killing it. Except for, what is that not doing? Well, it's not doing the do. I'm about doing the do. So what do we do now? Well, we've discovered the 5 barriers, and that they're in those reports. Love to talk to you more about that later. Jason's going to give me the cane, too. The 5 barriers to decarbonization, but more importantly, I want to talk about what we do. Let's just take 1 or 2 of them real quick. And when we have later conversations about it, let's dig into it deeply. The 5 barriers to decarbonization for the utility industry are, Funding, that's pretty clear, right? We all need money, don't have money. Technology and transmission. New technology and new and expanded transmission lines across our country and across our grid. Workforce development. We need a group of people who actually know how to maintain, manage, and deliver on the aforementioned two things. Underserved communities and socioeconomic disadvantaged communities need to be attended to. That has been mentioned several times already. That's our fourth barrier to decarbonization. Got to make it affordable for people who can afford it. And then lastly, customer education. We need to be able to make sure that when we say to customer Angel, hey Angel, I know that you love to cook and I know that you have a gas range, but guess what? That's not clean energy, so we're gonna start pumping hydrogen into your house. Cool? I'm gonna probably have a problem with that because that seems scary to me. I don't know what hydrogen is. Does it cook an egg the same way? I don't know. So customer education is really critical. Those are the 5 barriers. Great. We can talk about those all day. Let's talk about what we do about them. Just take workforce in itself, or take customer education. When I said I'm bringing sexy back to utilities, I believe that through clear, pretty infographics, bite-sized soundbite information that is data-driven, we can reach all of our stakeholders. Who are our stakeholders in the utility community? They are everyone. The people who are your ratepayers are also your regulators. The people who are your ratepayers are also your educators. The people who are your ratepayers are the government. The people, most importantly maybe, who are your ratepayers are also your investors. Bill Gates pays an electric bill every month. He has somebody do that for him, but he does it. So, all right, so I'm gonna bring it back. I'm gonna get kicked off here. Jason is giving me the look, but I want to finish this conversation, but I don't want to do it in the way about what has come before and what is in the way. I want to talk about tangible solutions, how we communicate, and then I want to give you how we communicate. Take a look at this report, dissect it, reuse it, put it in your PowerPoints, put it in your materials, put it on your social media, use it. I made it for you. And it educates and clearly communicates the utilities' journey to net zero. That's the first thing. Second thing that we're going to do is let's talk about how we shift funding. Let's talk about how utilities who are now on the hook to revolutionize our society. Utilities, if we do this well, will be the next Google, will be the next Microsoft. You will be the next platform. Do you think the metaverse is going to work without electricity? All those people with that thing on their head? They're just going to be sitting there. No electricity. We need to integrate. If we can become the matrix that we are, if we can embody that perspective, then we will become sexy. We'll get all the young people to come work for us. We'll drive innovation. We'll drive technology. We'll drive the public-private partnership that we must develop in order to move forward. We will drive workforce development and community elevation across the board. This is not a pipe dream. It is practical, it is tangible, and I have answers on how we do it. Maybe not all of them, but I have a lot of them. So when we converse after this, let's talk about what those are. Tangible actions. How are you going to turn your conference rooms that you currently train your utility employees into workforce development centers for your community? Pretty cheap, pretty easy. Just a matter of scheduling. What are you going to teach them? You're going to teach them how to maintain, how to deploy, how to speak about green tech that your utility is going to be championing, not only through your marketing materials, but through your actions. Let's talk about what you're going to do going forward. Thank you.
All right, we're going to add a few more chairs to the stage while we welcome our next group of panelists. You can go sit down. You can hang out right there. All right, moderating this session today is Laurel Morris, our utility and mobility project manager at Zpryme, and she will be introducing you to our panelists today.
Everyone, so utilities left and right have these 10 to 20 year net zero pledges that we're all seeing, and that's great, but how do we really track the progress of these utilities, and how do we determine who are the leaders in this space that we need to watch and learn from? So with that today, we have Linda, Eric, George, and Angel to really tackle this topic. And we'll start with George, who has a vast background in the utility space and now at SEW. How do you approach this difficult topic of net zero?
First of all, great topic to start. Thanks, Angel, for setting us up so well here. The challenge I think we've got is how do we know if we're doing enough? I mean, it is a time to act, which is absolutely the right call to answer. But how do we know if we're doing enough? How do we know if we're leading or lagging? How do we learn from those that are bold and are taking a stance here? And how do we measure progress? I think these are some of the questions that we should be asking ourselves now. We know that we're going to hear from some fantastic people over this 2 days. So I think it's important to look out for things. So I'm just going to try and explain a little bit about some of the things to look out for according to various bodies that have been observing progress around the world. So we've seen pledges to reach net zero from everywhere, from governments, from utility companies, from major corporations all around the world. We've seen it from investors with investor portfolios looking to invest in the right areas for the future. We've seen pledges that are actually aiming to reach absolute zero, not just net zero, which I think is a fascinating concept. And I know we're going to hear from Paul tomorrow about that. One such movement, though, that has evolved out of these conversations is the United Nations Race to Zero. This is a major theme being used in COP27 right now in Egypt as we speak. And COP stands for Conference of the Parties. And the net zero concept kind of originated in COP21 around the signing of the Paris Agreement. So it's a useful basis for us to start. But where are we today in terms of all of this? The good news is that net zero targets exist everywhere. They exist in corporate strategies, they exist in annual reports. Pledges are being made with governments, legislation is coming along in order to enforce that. But the real challenge is how do we assess whether we're doing enough, how do we know if we're doing the right things? So quite understandably, the focus is shifting now from the people that are setting up the legislation to applying scrutiny on the companies and the corporations that have to act on that legislation. Are they doing enough? How do we know? So this light is actually being shone on organizations. And what we're finding is that there are some organizations doing amazing things, but there are some organizations that are what has been termed greenwashing. And greenwashing is an interesting concept where you're basically doing the same thing, but you're putting an environmental sort of color to it. So we need to work out how do we know if somebody's greenwashing or whether they're real. But the good news is that plans really exist. Prior to coming over here from the UK, I did some monitoring of some research from Oxford University. They've got a body that is working with two other bodies called the Net Zero Climate and the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit. And they've done an assessment of 4,000 major corporations around the world to try and work out, so where are they really? Now, what they were looking for in this were four things. They were looking for 4 Ps. So it's useful to remember 4 Ps. One is the pledge. They're making a pledge. And who's making the pledge? Is it the shareholders? Is it the board? Is it the CEO? It has to be from somebody that has the means to act. They're looking for a plan, and they're looking at the quality of that plan. And they're looking for that plan to demonstrate progress in the interim period, not just a target in the distant future. They're looking for the ability to proceed. They're looking for real evidence that the organizations have set themselves up to act on this. And they're looking for the bold and courageous leaders that are willing to publish what they've learned, how they're doing, the mistakes they've made, as well as the progress that they've made. So 4 Ps, pledge, plan, the ability to proceed, and publish. And what Oxford University found out is of the 4,000 organizations, 769 of them, that's only 19%, had made bold pledges and had zero targets in place. That may not sound very impressive, but that 769 accounted for 61% of the global emissions, 68% of global GDP, and covered 56% of global population. So the companies that have the scale to act and make a difference are actually putting themselves out there. The challenge that was also uncovered in this research was that the pledges and the actions varied in their quality massively. So they look of those 20%, of those 769, only 20% of them satisfied the United Nations Race to Zero criteria for a robust plan. And the ones that, of that 20%, the ones that made the right pledges, the ones that had detailed and validated plans, and the ones that had a mechanism for reporting progress was less than 40%. So the general theme is, if we're looking for leadership across this, we've got to have the pledges, we've got to have a mechanism put in place to measure progress, we've got to have a detailed plan, and we've got to have bold and courageous leadership that is willing to get out there and make a difference. I think the energy and utility sector is really interesting. It's part of what's termed as critical infrastructure, as we all know. But critical infrastructure services account for 70% of global emissions. So we've got a big role to play. And we've got a big role to play not only for addressing how we operate as utilities or as organizations, but we've got a big role to play in order to engage with the communities that we serve, exactly as you mentioned, bringing the communities in. So I think that's really important. I had the privilege of interviewing somebody recently who really inspired me, an organization that was addressing decarbonization, digitalization, and the role that sits between them. And I was so inspired by them. On a personal level, I find this topic fascinating. I think we've got an obligation sitting in this room to make a difference. I'm really pleased to say that SEW is embracing that challenge. We have joined the United Nations Global Compact with Deepak's support, where we will go out there, we will pledge what contributions we're making internally on about how we operate, but also we'll make those contributions on how we help our utility partners reach their goals as well. So I think on the back of that, I'll hand over.
Thank you. Yes, it's almost like you read my mind. I was going to ask Angel next about greenwashing and how can we battle that and tackle the overhyping of smaller pilots and really embrace the net zero.
Well, greenwashing is a scary thing. I think in addition to greenwashing, there's green gating, which is a thing that I made up, which is when you go to your friend and you say, hey, so I just started composting. What do you think of that? And they say, yeah, but you eat McDonald's all the time, so you're just going to compost bad things, and it's totally not going to work out. So whatever you just said, you're trying to assist in your motion forward, they negate it, right? Greenwashing has been prevalent for a long time. And greenwashing, I think, is moving. I just got back from a conference of 33,000 CEOs in the world, and they do a lot of this greenwashing. And they don't just do it with the environment, they also do it with social issues. And there's no term for that yet, I don't think, but sort of pushing it under the rug a little bit and not wanting to discuss it. But ultimately, I think the way that we really drive progress in separating the rhetoric or the measurement, like you described, from the reality, is really just infusing practicality into it. If we can teach businesses how to their environmental aims and actions, their socioeconomic aims and actions, and their internal and external governance pursuits actually drive their profits, drive their ability to be bigger and better than they already are. If we infuse practicality into the conversation, the greenwashing naturally diminishes because we're speaking the language of business rather than the language of excuse.
Right, the language of business. And what are the key actions that, Eric, you're doing at your company to tackle those issues?
Yeah, thank you. So I like that, you guys talked about, greenwashing and the metrics. I think the words that we use and the metrics that we use are extremely important in terms of measuring progress. So I'll throw kind of a controversial concept out here where, I think all of us are probably proponents of energy efficiency, or would consider ourselves proponents of energy efficiency. And I would say that actually metrics like energy efficiency are starting to become perhaps counterproductive, because what we need to be focusing on now are things like carbon efficiency, which is different, right? There's a lot more complexity in something like carbon efficiency than energy efficiency. And I'll give you an example. I've had the fun of having to move a few times in recent years, and I've had to purchase new clothes washer and dryers, right? So it's always a fun experience buying new appliances, and I look for the energy efficient one, right? Because I'm an enthusiast. And what I've noticed is that things like clothes drying hasn't really changed much in the last 20 years. It takes a certain amount of energy to evaporate water, and that's just physics. So if you buy a brand new efficient clothes dryer, you just throw your wet clothes in there and hit the button and walk away, you probably are going to get damp clothes out of it because the device is just using less energy. It's doing less work. It's not actually more efficient. Now you have to go bump that setting up and get dry clothes. But and conservation isn't necessarily a bad thing if you're okay with damp clothes, but wouldn't it be better if we could still do the work that we wanted to do, but did it with sources of energy that were zero or low carbon? And that's where I think the system level approach is so important in terms of a practical nature, because now we have to say, all right, it's not just a matter of drawing the box around an appliance and making that appliance as good as we can. It's really looking at the power grid as a whole, because electricity travels at the speed of light, and it's one giant connected thing. So you need the metrology, you need the accuracy of measurement, speed, reliability, and security to be able to control things in real time to actually manage carbon output on the power grid.
Yeah, Georgia or Linda, what are your thoughts on those key actions?
Well, I would say it's a good start. I think the good news is, from a utility perspective, all utilities would love to get to net zero. I think that most utilities have made pledges to do so without really having the technology to know how to get there. And it's a bit of faith, which I don't think utilities have normally operated on. We like to have the facts and like to know how we're going to get somewhere. And right now, the technology is not there. And it is a complicated industry. You have thousands of utilities, whether municipals, investor-owned. You have in every state multiple regulators, some cities, counties, state regulators, and they're all different. And in many cases, if you operate in multiple states, they're almost competing with one another. So you have that, and now you have system operators on top of that that are trying to make sure we have 24/7 reliability for customers at the peak demand. And when you do that, it becomes really difficult. And how do you build a system that provides that? Because in this country, we want 100% reliability. We don't want that 24/7 that was spoken of earlier. So that is very complicated, and the system is getting more and more complicated. So I think we need help, quite frankly, and we need some kind of think tank on how we're going to get there. And we're really dependent on some of the really innovative companies out there to come up with the metals that we can use in batteries. It's not lithium ion. What is it? And is it available? And can we make it? So I just think there's a lot of positive things happening. And I might look at the opportunity with greenwashing. Sometimes I think if you say something to yourself enough, you start to act that way. So whether companies are doing that or not, I think if you keep doing it, you keep looking for that opportunity, and you keep looking for ways to get to net zero, and utilities do like to use the word pilot a lot. It sounds less risky that way, and it sounds less risky to regulators that way. You're not betting the company on a technology, so we pilot things for a couple years. We'll put in batteries, we'll try them small scale, then we'll try them large scale. I do think it is positive things are happening. The question I would ask is, how do we get there faster?
Yeah, I think just picking up on your question and what you said, Linda, one of the other WE3 partners I got to meet last year, and this particular person runs an organization which is trying to get beyond innovation theater. And the term innovation theater really hit me hard, because I've been around utilities a long time, and they're very risk averse, and they like to make a big event about we're doing this piece of innovation, which is, it says all the right things, it provides all the right things, it provides an answer to whatever they're trying to prove, but it doesn't make an impact. It doesn't make an impact at scale that it needs to. So, and the term that came along with the innovation theater was, it's all thrust and no vector, which I also thought was a really useful term to just put in our minds to say, how do we switch that around and put, apply some direction, apply some process, not process that slows it up, but apply some vector that actually says whatever thrust we can apply, we're applying it and it's moving us in the right direction. So, and there are organizations, particularly in the UK, that run great big innovation festivals, and they just simply don't work. You know, they're theater. They bring people together, they run a whole series of sprints, but they never really materialize in anything that has lasting change. And the primary reason for that is they're not bringing their customers and communities along for the ride with them. If we can win the hearts and minds of the customers and communities, and importantly, the citizens, we think about people as citizens now who care about the environment as well as their service. If we can win their hearts and minds and bring them on the journey, then all of a sudden the momentum for change will overcome the resistance and we'll reach a tipping point. And I think that's really interesting when you start thinking about human behavior there.
The NPUC is really focused on a lot of what you just described and has had some success. In brief stories, like when we sit and talk at these roundtables, we've learned about scenarios like a plan that Duke Energy is working on right now, where they're trying to solve the problem of managing low rate structures for disadvantaged communities. And the way that they came up about it is they wanted to have a fixed fee rate structure. And well, how do you get to a fixed fee rate structure? That seems good for low in disadvantaged areas, low income areas. Well, the way that you do it is you need to regulate heat management practices. So you need digital thermostats. Well, that's kind of interesting, but how do we get those to those communities? And then lastly, you need internet, right, in order to let those thermostats work. So Duke, thinking outside the box, realized, and I love this story because this is what utilities are going to need to do, is they needed to reach outside of utilities to come up with a program that's going to work. So here's what they did. They contacted AT&T. AT&T, turns out, also has a low-income practice for some of their rates around internet. And they were able to package their, let's say my utility bill is going to be $40 a month. $40 a month. Okay, great, and that includes that I'm also going to get internet now. And that means that Duke has partnered with AT&T. That's fantastic. Additionally, they needed the thermostats. How are we going to get those thermostats out there? They found out that Honeywell also has a program for deploying digital thermostats to disadvantaged communities. So the three companies, the utility, the telecom operator, and a device operator, banded together to come up with a solution that drives carbon emissions down, regulates usage, is available for an economically just community, and involves the community in the process. So that's where the NPUC comes into play, is that we get people together to talk about, wow, that's a great idea. What else could we do? Or in brief, Seattle City Light had a great community outreach where they recognized that utilities have been reaching out to their communities all along. Like, this is not new. They do it a lot. However, they often ask the wrong questions. And so they started employing people from those communities to be the liaison in their community outreach town halls. And they asked the communities, hey, what can we do? You guys need lower rate structures, different peak times, like maybe different devices like LED light bulbs, or access to different things. What do you need? We're here to help you. We want to collaborate. And the community representative stood up and said, that's really great. Yes, we'd love all those things. But actually what we really need, if you're really asking, is we need light bulbs in bus stops. Because most of us commute at dark, and it's dangerous because the bus stops don't have light. So it would be really helpful if you as the utility could help run electricity to bus stops. So it's fascinating through the NPUC to be able to learn solutions like this that maybe are a little bit unreachable unless the utilities themselves collaborate and talk about possibility, not talk about, or off of the back of the barriers.
Yeah.
Well,
Sorry, go.
I do think you also have to consider is all areas are not created equal. I was in a utility that was mostly rural, and some of these things AT&T doesn't serve so we were running fiber to all the small communities because we needed somebody who had that fiber going to it, so someone like AT&T could come in and run the end-use service. So I do think you have to think differently because the United States is very different utility to utility. So I do think there is some out-of-the-box thinking that has to happen, and I think the keynote speaker said you can't focus on what's worked in the past. You've got to look to the future, and it's going to be different, and for most utilities, it's going to be uncomfortable.
Oh, I love that you said that. Working with APS down in Arizona, one of the challenges they have is the sovereign nations. And they don't actually have easements or rights on various property that they must serve, and they must serve reliably and safely. That's a big challenge. Or up in Wyoming, where when we talk about decarbonization, when an entire economy is built on mining of fossil fuels, like, it's really difficult to have a conversation in a political environment that people don't want to have that conversation. Or in power markets across the United States that are driven by different geographical factors. Like, yes, it is complex. However, the answer really is about the collaboration of our energy distributors together. They're the only way to get through those knotholes is to discuss them amongst our industry, and then reach out to other elements of the equation, like the Honeywells or like the sovereign nations.
Yeah, I really like the practical approach that you both sort of discussed here, and that I think it gets really to the core of the issue of how we can actually sort of start solving this problem. I think a common theme we're probably going to hear today is, we saw this video, it was really well put together. It was, showing the scale of the problem. It's like, oh, holy crap, this is really scary, right? And you could probably show that to a lot of people, and they'd say, oh, this is amazing, a huge problem, and yet nobody does anything about it, right? And I suspect that the issue is the way that human beings are just motivated. If you're kind of on that Maslow's hierarchy of needs and you're already struggling to, eat or find clean water, you haven't even gotten to the point where you're like, well, I'm looking for fulfillment in my community, and then you're not even anywhere near the point of like, well, we need to worry about a global problem, right? And so the irony is that the more that we can do to kind of elevate the wealth of the world, to kind of pull people out of that, the more likely they are to be motivated to look at a big problem like climate change. And so by combining these services, right, so now you're saying, well, we have an affordable solution that's going to come in, it's going to help you with your energy consumption, provide internet, other connected devices. You create this sort of environment where, well, now you're solving an immediate problem, particularly for your utility, but you're also creating that sort of energy equity and access that as people get wealthier, as people get wealthier, they also use more energy, but they also become more motivated to use more clean energy. So this is really kind of a strange dynamic that's occurring there. But I think that's a huge piece of the puzzle, is actually convincing people that, everyone knows they should care, but they just don't have the resources or time or ability to actually go do something about it.
Oh, I love that you said that, but they do. And I hate, I'll be the naysayer in this regard, in that utilities are behind the times, way behind. And there's a lot of companies out there that are really driving this forward. One of my favorite examples is Ford. Ford is not a new company. You've probably heard of Ford Motor Company before. They've distributed something called the Ford Lightning. Anybody here heard of the Ford Lightning? It's electric F-150, the strongest selling car in the United States and also in Ford's line. They didn't market it as you should be green and drive electric cars because there's no fossil fuel emission. That's not how they did it. They marketed it to middle America and said, hey, guess what? Now you have a rolling generator that can run your tools on job site. And guess what? In California, if you have rolling blackouts or you have shutdown events because of wildfires, you have a home generator. You plug your truck into your house, and now your house works. And by the way, you unplug that truck and you run to the store and you get the milk, right? So they took a practical approach to something that people can attain. I have examples like that all the way up and down the socioeconomic chain, and how it is actually really tangibly available. You just have to start looking about. In that conference I told you about, all those CEOs, E is a foregone conclusion. They assume, most of them are publicly traded, that their investors will require that they shift their business models to attend to the environment. It's how they have to proceed in business to make money, to acquire capital, et cetera. It is a given. What most industry is concerned with now is the S in the ESG equation. Utilities, however, have both to contend with, maybe more so than the rest of industry.
Just picking up on your example from Ford, which I think is a fantastic example of how an electric vehicle becomes an amenity or a utility. We've been having some dialogue, and I hope it's okay to mention this, been having some dialogue with Procter & Gamble, and they approached us with an interesting question. They said, how can we monetize the bathroom experience? And you think, what does that mean? And they said, well, here's the challenge. Energy is expensive, water is cheap, hot water is expensive. how do we know if we are using the facilities in our house in the most efficient way? And Procter & Gamble, you think, well, why are Procter & Gamble asking us this question? And they said, I'll tell you why we're asking this question, is we supply product into almost every bathroom across the world in one form or another. Whether it's shampoo, whether it's soap, whether it's other forms of healthcare. We've got an obligation to say, how can we connect our product consumers into the energy and water that is required to use that product? And it just changed the conversation around by saying, how can we monetize the bathroom experience? And then you extend that again, say, how can we monetize the kitchen in terms of putting effective appliances in, as you mentioned, Eric? How can we monetize the other ways in which we live? And for a company like Procter & Gamble to be approaching SEW and saying, we think we've got the answer to a lot of things, but what we haven't got is we haven't got a platform to engage, educate, and empower the communities of people that want to sort of play their part in addressing the challenge that we have. And I found it fascinating, and the dialogue is ongoing, but I found it fascinating that here was a company with a global reputation and global scale that realizes it can work collaboratively with the utility sector and with the companies, the partners in this room, in order to make that kind of impact.
Yeah, George, we're going to have to grab a beer later. I'm going to write down all these phrases that you come up with, like energy, innovation theater and monetize the bathroom. Me too. I mean, I love it. And really what we're talking about here is essentially that coordination, right? So if this is what we do. All the hot water that we control, every watt of energy that goes into those water heaters was done so directed by the power grid, right? It can be used for frequency regulation to improve system reliability. It can be for renewables firming, and it's really that nexus, that communication and technology, I think, that allows you to essentially, you can call it monetize the bathroom, but you can also say, let's make the most of the storage and the assets that we have out there.
I'd like to join you guys for that beer, because you guys monetize it, I'll measure it, and then report on it. and then we got a thing. The band's together.
Measure your bathroom experience.
I will measure your monetized bathroom experience. It's interesting. You did jog my mind around. We also really need to admit things that are mistakes, things that don't work. For example, low flow toilets. Everybody got one of those? Heard about those? They're in hotels everywhere. What happens with a low flow toilet? What do? Come on. You flush it twice, or 3 times, or 7 times, and therefore you have negated the concept of low-flow toilets, right? Or the low-flow shower heads, right? What do? Take a longer shower. That's not good, right? So when we have these types of products like you're describing, or we have these types of approaches that maybe we're done in good faith, like your energy efficiency dryer, like you talked about, we've got to recognize that maybe while we thought that we were on the right track, we now need to innovate. Or our processes within utilities, or our programs that maybe we're trying to bring people in the fold or communicate with. And we've been doing that, and we're trying, but it's not working. Let's be honest about that. Or when we invested in that hot, cool technology because we met that guy and his company seemed so cool, and we threw $18 million at it, and the reality is a year later, we're no further. Okay, get a new one. We really need to, the way that we accelerate our decarbonization is by being more entrepreneurial in our approach. Try, didn't work. Try again, didn't work. Try again, didn't work. Try, worked. Part of it worked. Let's try that other part, right? I think that would get us a long way.
I agree. In fact, I'm going to name drop here. I got the opportunity to talk to Sanjay Banga a few weeks ago, and he talked about this concept of utility as a service, and he said, we've got an obligation here to provide reliable energy 24/7 or 7/24, etc. But the obligation we've really got is we've got to find a platform where we can engage with the customers and bring them on this journey with us so that they can be part of it. And that's the obligation that he said we've got as leaders in this sector, is to engage, provide a platform to engage. And he talked about the concierge model, which I also think is fascinating, where you don't necessarily engage with one utility. You engage with all the services that you need in order to live your lives. So the concierge model is simply the idea of you go to one place and you can get everything you need. But what it does is it turns the utilities into platform companies. And we all know about the famous platform companies. The Ubers, Amazons of this world. They do very simple things. They manage supply and demand, they introduce simple logistics, and they manage payment and finance. But they do it by bringing it together on a collaboration platform that connects everything together and creates a connected experience. And I would question whether the utilities can do this on their own, because I don't think they can. I think the utilities have got to open their minds and start forming new marketplaces where these things will come together. And I think that's quite a challenge for the utility sector. I've been in the utility sector all my life. I know it's a challenge to get them to change their paradigm, but actually I think they need to. And I think they'll only change it by looking way beyond the boundaries that they've existed.
There are other industries that are doing this. Take the agricultural industry, considered, the foundation of our civilization. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the agriculture industry. I think there are some people who are here. That industry is turning into a robotics industry. Our farms are being run by robots, where you can do a drone and you can actually drive your tractor from your living room. Like, it's pretty incredible, like some of the things that are happening there. Utility industry is construction industry. We build things and we maintain things and we spread out and drive our physical connection to others, just like the agricultural industry, very physical industry. So I do think that the utility, I agree with you. I think the utility industry will innovate when they have a strong platform to do so in the same way and with the same core necessity as agriculture is to our survival. So is the utility industry's service, and we have that same physical platform to build off of in a modern era.
I'm actually kind of curious to hear, Linda, what do you think about that in terms of like the nexus of like what you have to deal with regulators and that type of innovation?
And I think that is probably the biggest challenge, but maybe also an opportunity. I think we need to educate regulators just as much as we need to educate customers. I think people in general want to do their best. I think that's true of almost every industry. I do think that every time you add something in, I can't change my bill without going to regulators and saying, I want to add this line. And do you approve this? If I change the look, it takes months. So I do think there is some challenges beyond the utilities. I do think there is a paradigm shift that is happening, probably not as fast as some people would like it to happen, but I love a quote, and I don't know who to give credit to, but how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And I think sometimes we are so focused on eating the elephant, we never take a bite. And I think if we can just do the Duke things and lay fiber where there's no internet and do different things across this country, I think then the collaboration of all of that, you can look at it and say, what will work in our area? And I think that's happening, probably not at the pace it needs to happen. It needs to be faster. But I do think there is some opportunity there. We work with different companies. We've been working with many internet providers to see who would go and do the endpoint. And quite frankly, for them, it's a business decision. And when you have a town of 600 people, they're really not interested. And often some of these rural areas are very impoverished areas. So you have to look at how can we afford that and work with another company to say, okay, for these lower income groups, how do we provide service, internet, power, all of these things? And it's a big problem that you have to solve, and you cannot solve it by yourself.
I'd love to invite you to the council for just this type of discussion. We're working with PG&E in Northern California, not PGE Portland, Pacific Gas and Electric in San Francisco. You probably are aware that they're undergrounding 10,000 lines of, big project. And we're thinking, how are we going to measure this? And how are we going to explain how we're trying to really address this practically from an environmental, from an ESG perspective? And then speak to that without greenwashing, because that's critical, right? And so, and similar, there's geographic challenges, there's community challenges, there's, believe it or not everybody in California lives in San Francisco. Some people live in some place you've never heard of. There's actually this place they're trying to succeed from California and come to their own country. Like, really, they can be very rural in California. But one of the things that we're thinking about is just, let's get out of the box. Like, what if we have solar-powered generators on site? What if we did? Like, we do our work mostly during the daytime. Like, could that work? I don't know. I mean, we have to pilot it, right? And then we talked to Austin Energy. Well, Austin Energy has done this, right? And this is what worked and what didn't work. So really that conversation with people in the know about the challenges that utilities face and the variety of those things together is the power. Because I like to say the smart people aren't coming. I can't wait for them. Like, they're not going to show up. Like, we're the smart people. So we need to talk to each other. And when we do that, we're not going to be right 100% of the time, but we are going to get further.
And I do believe we feed off one another when we do that. And you can get there faster collaboratively than individually.
I'll be super brief here. I know we're really out of time, but I know Lorraine is in the room over there. I got the opportunity to speak to Lorraine last year, and you mentioned regulation, and that Lorraine has a fantastic story to tell about how regulation moved from the back end of the value chain, if you like, from a penal and monitoring point of view, to a driver at the front in order to use regulation to introduce and accelerate change. I don't know if, Lorraine, you're going to get the chance to talk about it, but it really hit me hard when you talked about how... Okay. It was really interesting how regulation moved to the front of the conversation rather than at the back where we're all sort of used to it being.
Thank you. This has been an absolutely riveting conversation, and we're definitely brushing into some of our networking time. But feel free to talk to all of these thought leaders throughout the event, and I'll hand it to Ricky.
Thank you.